Now, a lot of you have probably already seen or heard about this interview on the Joe Rogan podcast, where he and Kanye West talk about Star Wars of all things, about why the original trilogy and the prequels worked so well and were so good, while the sequel trilogy wasn't so good and why something just felt off about it. And if you haven't seen it, I'll try to remember to include a link in the description below. Anyway, basically what they said was it all boiled down to purity, that the first 6 Star Wars movies essentially were the vision of one man, of George Lucas, and that above all else it felt like he just wanted to tell his story, one very much based on the hero's journey. And since this is what motivated him, conveying his story, it ended up having an impact on people and you could make a connection to it and the characters within. While with the sequel trilogy, you end up feeling nothing because they're engineered, that at the heart you have Disney, this massive corporation that at the end of the day only cares about Star Wars insofar as how much money can be made from it. I mean, let's be real, they didn't purchase Lucasfilm for just over $4 billion just for the honor of carrying on the story Lucas had started. If that had been the case, they probably wouldn't have thrown out his story treatments for the sequels. Instead, they spent that kind of money on Lucasfilm and primarily to attain Star Wars because they want a big return on their investment, and that's how they see Star Wars. It's an investment. And look, I don't necessarily blame or hate them for that. And as I've said before, if handled right, Star Wars in the hands of Disney could, theoretically, be a win-win scenario for both them and us, the fans. After all, they certainly have the means and or resources to create a great deal of well-made Star Wars content. And if you put the right people in charge of creating that content, those not only with love for and or knowledge of Star Wars, but who also care about the integrity of it all, and if you allow them to do their thing with minimal interference from above, there's a great chance fans will love what they're doing, and that the money for Disney will follow. And to me, thus far at least, that's what The Mandalorian feels like. It feels like Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau have basically been allowed to create pure Star Wars. And my biggest fear for that series is that Disney will see that success and try to capitalize off of it as much as they can, and want to cram more and more into the show in order to do everything from sell merchandise to create pointless spin-off series. Not to say any and all spin-offs it may or may not generate would be pointless, only that Disney will want ones that they feel, based on the numbers, will generate the most revenue for them, over the ones that just make for the best stories, even though focusing on the better story is bound to generate more revenue in the long run, which is something I certainly don't think they understood with the sequels. Which, yeah, they made a lot of money initially or at the box office, but now, less than a year after being done, are just sitting there selling little or no merchandise and not spawning any new stories for them to further profit from. Because, as I've said many, many times before, and I think most of you will agree, the failing of the sequels is having no solid game plan in place going into them, and maybe even more importantly, that it lacked a shared vision between those who created it. Because yes, and I recently had a very interesting discussion with someone about this topic, but the sequel trilogy, though it suffered from not having a solid game plan going in, could have still worked if it still had at least one solid, singular vision and a talented person or people behind it. Because not every writer starts out a story knowing exactly how it's going to end, or even where it's remotely going sometimes, and this can certainly lead to a disaster, or an author hitting a wall at some point. But sometimes with the right and talented author, it can lead to a more natural and organic feeling story. And as I've said before, I fully believe George R.R. Martin, who wrote the Game of Thrones books, though technically it's called A Song of Ice and Fire, that he's the type of writer who probably just sits down and writes and lets the story or the characters go where it takes him, with maybe only a vague idea where he wants it all to eventually end. And that writers like Benioff and Weiss, who did the show for HBO, don't have that same level of talent or just write differently, hence the mess that the later seasons of the show turned into when it was up to them to carry it on and then to finish it without Martin's books to directly work from. And so, yes, a very talented writer probably could make the Star Wars sequels up as they went, and we could have ended up with something epic, fluid, and amazing, but that certainly didn't happen from the combined team of Abrams and Johnson. Another huge factor here is that Disney no doubt had their hands all over the creation of the sequels, especially the first one, or Episode 7, and also probably the last one, it seems. There's just no way they spent that kind of money on Star Wars and turned it over completely to Lucasfilm, even though that may have been their best bet, but then again, maybe not with Kennedy at the helm. Either way, we know Disney execs like Bob Iger and Alan Horn were heavily involved in the original discussion process regarding the sequels, and no doubt they were making a lot of calls, or at least giving a lot of directives. Which is ultimately what I think happened to Episode 7, and why I think it was the most heavily influenced of the three. No doubt Abrams was told to make something that felt like the original Star Wars to take people on a nostalgia trip, which is exactly what that movie is or tries to be. Episode 8 then is probably the most hands-off from Disney, and this may have been done in an effort to create another shocking movie like The Empire Strikes Back was. But unfortunately, the guy with his hands all over it was Rian Johnson, who again had a very different vision than Abrams, among other problems with that movie that I've gone over before. Then with 9, Abrams was probably given the directive to fix what people didn't like with Episode 8, and to make all the fans happy, which was not only impossible, but the harder he tried to please everybody, the more he ended up pleasing almost no one. And maybe the real irony here is the prequels are like the exact opposite of the sequels in so many respects. Lucas having a well thought out plan and streamlined vision going into it was probably the saving grace of those films. It's that excellent and cohesive underlying story that really makes the prequels something special, even if the execution isn't always on point. Furthermore, unlike the sequels with this big cloud known as Disney overhead at all times, George Lucas answered to no one when it came to the prequels. Literally no one could tell him what to do with those movies. Not only was Lucasfilm entirely his privately owned company, and those movies made with his money, but the distributor, 20th Century Fox, wasn't about to try and tell George Lucas of all people what should be done with Star Wars. In fact, no one was going to try and do that. And if you watch any of the behind-the-scenes stuff from the prequels, all anyone ever does when talking to him is smile and nod. He was completely surrounded by yes men. And I do get it, don't get me wrong. How do you argue about Star Wars with George Lucas of all people? I know I wouldn't be able to sit down there and tell him he's wrong about this or that. And though I do love the prequels, I can certainly say they have some flaws. And I wonder what those movies would have ended up like if George Lucas had someone there to maybe give him some pushback now and again. Or if he hadn't directed all three of them, we just may have ended up with something on par with the original trilogy, where both those things happened, and where Lucas was allowed to be this visionary leader presiding over the whole thing, and where everyone around him would work to make his story the best it could possibly be. Which brings us right back full circle to the main problem with the sequels. No visionary leader, no one person knew what the story should be, and or cared about the integrity of it above all else. And like Joe Rogan said in his podcast, it's not a work of art, it's a formula. And so whereas the prequels felt like something born of or grown organically from the imagination of one man, where we ended up with an end product that sure had a few defects on the surface, but was otherwise still natural and pure within, the sequels felt like a genetically modified version of the originals, created by a team in a lab somewhere in an effort to create something to be consumed by the masses. And though it looked shiny and nice on the outside, when you peeled that back, you found nothing but a hollow core. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Did you see the clip from the Joe Rogan podcast where he and Kanye West talk about all this? Do you agree with them or not? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.